Good evening. Welcome to Mellon Middle School. My name is Chris Wolfson. I am the principal here at Mellon. I just want to welcome you to our orchestra concert tonight. So if you can check your cell phones, make sure those are silenced so we can avoid any interruptions. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Promise you I sound check.
Hello. All right. Good evening. Thank you for being here. Quick scene change. If the sixth graders could quietly and carefully make your way up. Remember, half of you over here, half of you over on this side. We'll be right back with you.
Take your time. Take your time. Careful.
All right, folks, thank you again. I think we're about ready to start. I'll double check with them in a second. I'll be plugging the program notes many times this evening, as you can see. That'll kind of help speed things along because I won't talk so much. And also, it'll give you something to do, to read in between the changes. But you might have seen that we did a little bit of work on improvisation with NPIN Ensemble. And once again, that Caroline's solo was completely improvised. It was pretty awesome. We had several musicians give that a go during the rehearsals. And if you like the idea of learning to improvise, boy, do I have a camp for you. No shameless plugs here, but musicwithatwist.org. All right, sixth grade has 4 pieces for you, and again, so many things I'd like to say. I'm going to let the 11 pages of notes that I wrote speak for me, and we're just going to play through the 4 tunes. So I hope you enjoy King William's March. As everyone is carefully coming off stage, Pops, come on up. I'm just going to draw attention to the elephant in the room, which is this, my second baton. So if you notice this and it's better than looking at the actual condition of the finger. That's why I have it taped, so I'm sorry, but I'm sure it's a little bit distracting. So it's just a second baton. All right, as sixth grade's getting settled back in, always sixth grade is just their progress from from fall till spring always baffles me. But it still always baffles me. So that's a really great group. I remember telling them in the winter, hey, I'm gonna really try to challenge you in the spring. And I really tried to. I just have to try harder in seventh grade. Really, really fabulous group. So once again, sixth grade, kudos, well done. And as you'll see in your program notes, QR code there in your program if you want to read, Pops just didn't have the time to rehearse that it normally does, and you really wouldn't know if I wasn't telling you or if you couldn't read about it in your program notes. They sound absolutely fabulous. So we're going to do two tunes for you, a Taylor Swift tune, and then kind of a new song you probably have not heard of before. So we hope you enjoy Taylor Swift and then this other song. As Pops carefully makes their way off 7th grade, you can also carefully make your way up. Remember, come up the side you sit on. We'll be right with you. Enjoy those notes. I know it was listed in the proper program, not the notes. But we had a couple guests with us there, so it was nice to be joined by Amelia and Bridget. So thank you guys for joining us. It was a lot of fun. And Sophia, some great bass guitar playing for Pops as well. So round of applause for Sophia. And now would be a great time, it's always a great time, it's never a bad time to thank Stuart Monticello, but round of applause for Stuart back there on the drum set. All right, we hope you enjoy 7th grade. Colin Bozick on marimba back there. One more round of applause. That was awesome. And also, Mr. Cheskowich on shaker. Thank you very much. All right, as 7th grade makes their way off stage, chamber orchestra, please come on up. For a little context while they are on their way up here, how many of you saw Wizard of Oz last month right here? It was incredible. So I want to make sure I loved it. I thought it was incredible. I did a poor job of looking ahead and realizing that, oh, we're going to have to pivot a little bit. So we did Pops and Chamber. I'm sure most of you are aware, but for about 3 months they're never rehearsed, and instead we had sectionals every week. So I just made out like a sectional calendar and hoped we could keep everything afloat until we got everybody back together. And then of course last week, you know, Stormageddon threw another wrench in all of our plans. I couldn't believe today in rehearsal how well these groups did. I think after this is year 20, I think I'm going to stop being surprised by the students in Mount Lebanon at some point. But they did just a fantastic job of bringing everything together. And believe it or not, and also, I should say, because it was like an under an hour concert in the winter, I hope I can pull from some of that social equity now. This one's going to be more like an hour 20, but we'll move it along, I promise. I forgot where I was going with that comment. So it must not have been that important. Here's Chamber. folks. Thank you for hanging out. I originally envisioned doing half of our program today, half of the program tomorrow, and I guess I just couldn't pick songs and tell them, no, we're not going to play these for the parents, and I just figured probably better to let you all hear everything, even if I'm an extra 20 minutes in here. So, glad you're enjoying it. Tomorrow's 2 o'clock assembly, I set up a live stream for it before I decided that we would do everything. So if you want to watch tomorrow's live stream, or if you have any friends, family that missed this and want to watch the live stream, 2 o'clock tomorrow, the link is in the... Yes, the link is in the hub. Oh, 8th grade, come on up. Let's go. Sorry guys, come on up. I know it's hard to believe it's actually going to get even better than this, but wait till you hear this group. We hope you enjoy your 8th grade orchestra. That was the talented Stuart on the chimes. That's one of my favorite. I love the chimes in that piece. He did a great job on them. So one more round of applause, please, for Stuart. I crawled out of my cave that is my life just long enough today to hear that there's a new pope. That's literally all I heard. But what an appropriate day to play Ave Maria. So, all right. I'll read more about it later. So most of you have been here for more than just this orchestra concert. So a couple words that I have for the 8th grade, and then I've heard they have a few words as well, and then we'll get you back home to bed after you hear Mamma Mia. Mamma Mia sounds so good, you're gonna love it. But first, my scripted words, so I don't ramble. Here we go. I hope you took a moment to read through the program notes. And as you saw, between the names on the back of the program and the people listed, there are many people to thank for tonight's concert. I did not thank families of the musicians in those remarks. So musicians, let us please shuffle for your families. It's very enthusiastic. Good job. All right. In trying to find a gift to honor this group, as always, I tried to find a common thread or a pulse that more or less unites the entire group. In looking at this group, I started to see that it's a very athletic and sport-minded 8th grade. I think more than any group I've had before. And I'm sure I'm going to miss some things here, but the students in this 8th grade orchestra competitively ski, cycle, wrestle, do track and field, figure skate, snowboard, play soccer, play lacrosse, field hockey, baseball, football, volleyball, rugby, and tennis. I can't believe they don't come in here just broken and bruised constantly. I'm quite certain, even though I really tried, I probably left some things off the list there. So it's a very athletic group. So to honor this group, a donation was made to the YMCA of Greater Pittsburgh in honor of the Mellon Middle School Orchestra Class of 2029. So thank you all for inspiring that gift. And then, as I said, I believe they have a few words before Mamma Mia. So let's go.
I'm already breaking a lot of rules. I have my phone out, so sorry. We never thought this day would come so fast. It feels like just yesterday we walked into the school to be welcomed by a huge smile. But now we are standing on the edge of the stage at our very last middle school concert. There are people you can only meet once, whether a firefighter, musician, teacher, or even a lunch monitor. But we met someone who acquired all of these traits. It's not every day you can meet someone with this many talents. A teacher allows a student to create friendship, but not only a friendship, a way to create a lifelong memory.
Mr. Cook taught us many lessons. He taught us that the truth is, no one is going to do it for you, that no one is handing out success or giving away greatness. We are the ones who have to strive to learn and do the task of living. But he also taught us it's okay to have fun. As you might recall, he does monitor the cafeteria right in front of our table. Daily, we drop oranges or water bottles, and he stares at them rolling and then grabs them for us. Since Mr. Cook won't have such an interesting table to monitor next year, we made him a little gift. Good evening. Thank you for your time and attention and for giving me the chance to express my gratitude to Mr. Cook. First, Mr. Cook, thank you for helping the orchestra grow together to create a community. Thank you for inspiring and pushing me to always strive for better. Thank you for your constant dedication to everything, whether it was being ready with highlighters and pencils or even being ready to share wisdom and advice. Thank you for the laughter that you encouraged in class, but more importantly, thank you for getting us back on track. And finally, thank you, Mr. Cook, for making this an amazing 3 years.
Some teachers were good, some teachers were bad, but Mr. Cook was great. No matter what. No matter what kind of day I had, I would always look forward to orchestra because I knew it would be amazing. The class doesn't determine whether it's fun or boring, the teacher does, and our class was really fun. I must admit, I'm a bit scared of high school, but if the orchestra teacher is half as good as Mr. Cook, I think I'll be good.
Okay, so I prepared nothing, so we're gonna give this a whirl. Other than the whole music thingy, Mr. Cook has taught us stuff from anything to
sports to life in general. And I'd just like to thank him for all that he has done to help me and my fellow classmates mentally and I'd say physically, but that doesn't work at all. So Mr. Cook, thank you so much for everything you've done for us. I think I might hug you.
Mr. Cook, you have helped us through many highs and lows and have helped us grow throughout our entire middle school years.
We will forever be thankful for everything Mr. Cook has done for us. For letting us skip our team times with our boring teachers to goof around with him, to picking out the most fun music I've ever played. He is the most awesome orchestra teacher, and he even continued to give me coffee after I broke his grinder. Sorry, by the way.
We decided to embrace your firefighter side of always helping us, and we got you a little mini firefighter to represent you.
Oh my gosh, that is awesome.
His name is Clem. There are notes at the bottom of the box that we all wrote about our thankfulness for Mr. Cook.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I wanted to take a moment to thank someone who has meant so much to me over these past 3 years, Mr. Cook. Middle school is a time of change, of figuring out who you are and where you belong. For me, orchestra was that place. I vividly remember the start of 6th grade telling my parents I wanted to quit, yet I'm happy I did it. Instead, it became a home, a constant, and a source of strength. You didn't teach us how to play our instruments, you taught us how to listen, not to the music but to each other. You taught us how to keep going when things felt overwhelming and how to find the beauty in the little things, like a perfectly in-tune chord you made us play about 200 times, or a quiet moment of rest before where the music begins again. There are days when life outside of the music room felt hard to even get through the day, but walking into that class and seeing you there, always with a smile and open arms for us, made those days a little bit easier. Your encouragement, your kindness, and your insane amount of patience has meant more than you probably realized. Thank you for helping me find my voice through music and being a support through my journey, and thank you for creating a space where I truly felt like I belonged. I will never forget what you've given me, and I will carry these memories and the music with me always. Thank you, Mr. Cook. And as a whole, we decided that I think you needed an upgrade of your violin, so we have designed you a bedazzled violin with all of our names signed on the back. So let's have a round of applause for that.
I'm humbled. Thank you for giving them your ears, and these are awesome presents. All right, we hope you enjoy Mamma Mia. Have a wonderful night. Thank you so much. Thank you again. Just a little housekeeping. Remember, cellos can stay in the parking lot, basses can stay on stage. All instruments can go back in the orchestra room. We do this again, shorter version tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So families, they just need a minute to put their stuff away, and then they'll meet you back up here. Thank you again. Have a beautiful evening. Be safe. Thank you. What's up, Fred? Yeah. What up?